Close your eyes. Let the world around you grow very quiet. Let the sounds of the day, the traffic, the voices, the small persistent worries, let all of it fall away, one layer at a time, until there is nothing left but the soft sound of your own breathing, and the darkness behind your closed eyes, and this voice. You are safe. You are still. You have nowhere to be and nothing to do. The night is long, and we have plenty of time. Tonight, we travel a very long way. We are going back more than 2,000 years, to a city that no longer exists, in a world that no one living has ever seen. We are going to Babylon. It is early June, in the year that we now call 323 BC. The sun has set hours ago over the flat Mesopotamian plain, and the air has cooled slightly from the ferocious heat of the day. Here in summer, cool is a relative term. It is perhaps 25 degrees, warm enough that the people of the city who sleep on their flat rooftops rather than the stuffy rooms below have come out onto their sleeping mats and are lying under the open sky, their faces turned upward toward the stars. The stars here are extraordinary. The plain of Mesopotamia is flat for hundreds of miles in every direction, and there are no mountains, no hills to interrupt the great dome of sky overhead. The Milky Way is visible as a river of pale light crossing from one horizon to the other, and the stars are so numerous, so bright, that you could almost believe the ancient Babylonian astronomers who spent their entire lives mapping them. These men could predict eclipses centuries in advance. They had names for every star, stories for every constellation, and they looked up at this same sky every night for generations and felt that the universe was, at its heart, orderly and knowable. Below those stars, the city breathes in darkness. Babylon is immense. Its outer walls enclose an area of roughly 2,000 acres, larger than any city in the Greek world, larger than anything most of the soldiers camped outside its gates had ever seen. The walls themselves are legendary, 3 circuits of brick, the outermost rising 50 feet and wide enough at the top for 2 chariots to pass each other with room to spare. The Euphrates River flows through the center of the city, carrying the muddy, life-giving water down from the mountains of Armenia far to the north, and a great bridge of stone and timber connects the 2 halves of the city across its slow current. The Ishtar Gate stands at the northern entrance, a towering arch of deep blue glazed brick, covered in raised reliefs of dragons and bulls and lions, the sacred animals of the Babylonian gods. Even now, at midnight, the torches mounted in brackets on either side of the gate cast a warm orange light across those brilliant blue tiles, and the effect is of something burning from within, something alive. Past the gate, the processional way leads south through the heart of the city, wide enough for the great religious processions to move in full splendor. On either side, the walls of the temples and palaces rise in the darkness, their upper stories lost in shadow. And somewhere in the deepest heart of this city, in the ancient palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the same Nebuchadnezzar who had conquered Jerusalem 6 centuries before, whose hanging gardens were counted among the 7 wonders of the world, somewhere in that palace, in a room lined with cedar panels and lit by a dozen oil lamps whose light makes the shadows move softly on the walls, the greatest conqueror the world has ever known is dying. His name is Alexander. He is the son of Philip of Macedon and Olympias of Epirus. He was tutored as a boy by Aristotle himself, who taught him rhetoric and philosophy and biology and the art of reasoning clearly about difficult things. He became king at 20 when his father was assassinated at a wedding. He became master of the Greek world at 22. He crossed into Asia at 23, at the head of an army of 37,000 soldiers, and spent the next 11 years marching east. He defeated the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Egypt to Afghanistan, in 3 major battles, each one a masterpiece of military art. He crossed the Hindu Kush in midwinter, the passes choked with snow, his soldiers wrapping their feet in strips of leather because their boots had worn through. He fought elephants in the monsoon rains of India, on the banks of a river called the Hydaspes, and won. He founded cities everywhere he went, more than 20 of them, all called Alexandria. Most are dust now. 1. in Egypt, survived. It still exists today, a city of 5 million people who live in a place named for a young king who walked through it once, briefly, more than 2,000 years ago. He marched 22,000 miles in 11 years. He never lost a battle. And now he is 32 years old, and something has found him that no army could face, and he is losing. Let us go back to where it began. Let us go back to the evening of May the 29th, to a banquet given by his Admiral Medius of Larissa. Medius was one of those men who appear in the histories of great rulers as a permanent presence at the edge of the frame, never quite central, but always there, always trusted, always present at the significant moments. He had been with Alexander since the early campaigns in Asia Minor, and he was one of the king's few genuine intimates, one of the small circle of men with whom Alexander could relax and be something other than a king. The banquet was held in one of the palace's great reception halls. The room was magnificent, cedarwood ceiling 40 feet overhead, walls covered in the deep blue and gold glazed tile that was the signature of the Babylonian royal style, the floor inlaid with geometric patterns of dark and pale stone. Oil lamps hung from iron brackets along the walls and from the cedar beams above, and their light was warm and amber, and it moved softly with the drafts that came through the high windows from the garden beyond. The guests were the inner circle of Alexander's world. Nearchus the Cretan, his admiral, who had navigated the fleet from India through waters no Greek captain had ever sailed. Perdiccas, commanding general of the cavalry. Ptolemy, quiet and watchful, the most politically intelligent of the senior generals. Lysimachus. Seleucus. These men had spent the last 11 years marching across 3 continents, fighting in every conceivable terrain and condition. They were between 35 and 50 years old, hardened by a decade of the most demanding campaigning any army had ever undertaken, loyal to one another and to the king who had made them great. Alexander arrived at the banquet in high spirits. He had been finalizing the plans for the Arabia campaign, his next great adventure, a voyage of exploration and conquest down the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Ships were being built at the harbor south of Babylon. Sailors who knew the Arabian coastline had been hired. The campaign was supposed to begin in just a few days, before the worst of the summer heat set in. At the banquet, Alexander drank freely and talked and laughed and listened to a young man play the kithra. The evening was, by all accounts, pleasant and uneventful. And then, sometime after midnight, Alexander felt unwell. The ancient sources disagree about what precisely happened at that moment. The royal diaries, the official daily records of Alexander's court, describe him feeling pain after drinking a large cup and retiring to bed. Later accounts added dramatic details. The cup was said to be enormous, the reaction immediate and visible. One tradition says he cried out as if pierced by an arrow. Historians have argued about these contradictions for centuries. What is not in dispute is what happened the next morning. When Alexander woke, he had a fever. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle a little deeper into whatever surface is beneath you. Let the muscles in your face relax, and the muscles in your shoulders, and the long muscles along either side of your spine. You are safe, and still, and the night is long. In the ancient world, fevers were common and usually not cause for immediate alarm. Men recovered from fevers constantly. Alexander himself had recovered from a serious fever years earlier in Cilicia, when his doctors had been genuinely afraid and he had insisted on swimming in a cold river against their advice. So on the first morning of his illness, the physicians were not yet frightened. They recommended rest and cool compresses and the usual prayers to Asclepius. Alexander complied, or tried to, for he was never good at being still. He moved to a room near the palace gardens, where the air was cooler and the sound of a fountain drifted up through the high windows. Through the window, when the breeze moved the curtain aside, you could see the tops of the palm trees and a strip of night sky above them, thick with stars. He lay there and listened to the fountain and waited for the fever to break as it always had before. On the second day, the fever was slightly lower. Everyone breathed a little easier. On the third day, it was worse. By the fourth day, the pattern had established itself. Morning brought a slight easing, an interval of cautious hope, and then the afternoon brought the fever back, harder and higher than before. Alexander spent the cooler morning hours receiving reports and dictating replies. By afternoon he would be back on his couch, covered with damp cloths, his doctors conferring quietly in the corridor outside. Word was now spreading through the army. 30,000 Macedonian soldiers camped outside Babylon's walls had begun to hear the whispers. The king is unwell. The king has a fever. The king has not been seen. For men whose entire understanding of the world was organized around this one individual, whose sense of purpose and safety was entirely bound up in the survival of their king, this information was deeply unsettling. The soldiers went about their tasks with less energy. The usual noise of a military camp was muted. Men who passed one another exchanged looks that contained the question no one wanted to ask aloud. On the fifth day, Alexander asked to be carried to the great pool in the palace gardens. It was early morning, before the heat of the day had built, and the garden was cool and green, watered by channels that drew from the Euphrates. The pool was large and rectangular, its surface lying perfectly still in the early light. Palm trees stood around its edges, and the reflections of their trunks lay in the water like dark columns. The whole scene had the quality of a place designed for sitting quietly and letting the world arrange itself. His admiral Nearchus came to see him that morning. Nearchus had been his friend since boyhood. They had grown up together at the Macedonian court, hunted together in the forests of Macedon, studied together under Aristotle's instruction. He sat by the pool, and the two men spent time together in the early morning quiet. The sources do not tell us what they said. They preserve only the fact of the visit, and the detail that afterward, when Nearchus walked away through the palace corridors, he was weeping, and that the soldiers who saw him understood immediately that this was serious. That evening, Alexander was carried back to his room. Breathe slowly. Let the image of that still pool rest in your mind, the reflections of the palm trees, the pale morning sky, the quiet of the garden in the early light. The sixth day passed. The seventh day began. On the seventh day, something changed that could not be undone. Alexander's voice began to fail him. It happened gradually over the course of the day. In the morning he could still speak, though his voice was weaker than usual, slightly hoarse. By afternoon it had become a whisper, difficult to hear across the room. By evening even the whisper was fading. He could open his mouth and move his lips, but the sound that emerged was almost nothing, only breath, shaped by his lips into the ghost of words that the men leaning closest to him had to strain to interpret. When the soldiers outside the palace learned that their king had lost his voice, the grief that moved through the camp was unlike anything the ancient sources had seen before. Professional soldiers, men who had learned over years of campaigning to contain their emotions, these men stood in the dust outside the palace walls and wept openly, without shame. The doctors, understanding what was needed, ordered that any soldier who wished to pass through the king's chamber and see him should be permitted to do so. They came in their thousands. They filed through in a continuous stream that lasted hours, from mid-morning through the long afternoon and into the early evening. Most had never been this close to Alexander. They knew him as the figure on the white horse at the battle's edge, the distant commander whose decisions determined whether they lived or died. Now they saw him close, pale against the silk cushions, thin in a way he had not been before, his golden hair dull and tangled on the pillow. But his eyes were open, and they were still his eyes. Each soldier who passed through that room and met those eyes felt something that is difficult to name, a recognition, perhaps, that the man who had led them to the ends of the world was still present, still aware, still unmistakably himself. He could not speak. He could not raise his hand. But he looked at each of them, steadily, and they felt it. Some soldiers reached out as they passed and briefly touched the edge of his couch, or his hand where it lay at his side, a gesture of contact, of confirmation that this was real and not a dream. The procession continued for hours. Outside, the line of soldiers waiting to enter stretched back through the palace gardens and out through the great gates into the streets of Babylon, where citizens of the city had gathered to watch these foreign soldiers standing quietly in line to say goodbye to their king. When the last soldier had passed through, Alexander closed his eyes. "You are drifting now. Let the image of that room rest softly behind your eyes. The amber light of the oil lamps. The long line of sunburned faces. The silence that settled after the last man filed out through the door. On the 9th day, the 7 senior generals gathered at his bedside. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Leonatus, Pathan, Aristonus. The men who had risen highest in his service. The men who would, in the years to come, tear his empire apart and divide the pieces among themselves, though none of that had happened yet. On this evening, they were simply soldiers, men in their 30s and 40s, sitting around the bed of a dying friend. One of them asked the question that could not be delayed any longer. "To whom do you leave the kingdom?" Alexander opened his eyes. He looked at each of them in turn, with the direct assessing gaze that had always been one of his most distinctive qualities, the gaze of a man who read people quickly and accurately and made decisions in fractions of a second. And then he raised his right hand, just slightly, just enough, and made a small gesture with his fingers. The word the sources record is kratisto. It means either to the strongest or to the best. It may have been a deliberate answer, intentionally vague, leaving the succession to the play of power that would follow his death. It may have been that he could no longer form coherent sentences and this single word was the closest his failing mind could reach. No one, in all the centuries since, has ever known for certain which it was. No one moved. Perdiccas leaned forward. He asked, "And when shall we make divine offerings to you?" The room waited. Alexander said nothing. Or he tried to speak and could not. The ancient sources diverge here, and the truth is lost in the long distance between that room and this night. The generals sat in silence. The oil lamps flickered in a draught from the window. Somewhere in the palace gardens, an owl called once and then was quiet. Let your breathing slow to its deepest, most natural rhythm now. You are very nearly asleep. The story is almost done, and the night is very deep around you, and you are safe and warm and still. On the evening of the 11th day of his illness, June the 10th, in the year 323 BC, the rhythm of Alexander's breathing changed. It became slower and more shallow. The intervals between one breath and the next grew longer, and the generals and doctors who sat around the bed counted those intervals in silence. In the deepest hours of the night, when Babylon was as quiet as it ever became, when the last torches in the streets had guttered out, when even the river seemed to move more slowly in the darkness, Alexander's breathing stopped. He was 32 years old and 10 months. He had marched his army 22,000 miles across 3 continents. He had never been defeated in battle. He had founded cities that would outlast his empire by centuries. He had crossed mountains and deserts and great rivers, and he had looked out, once, from a high place in India and known that beyond those eastern mountains lay more land than any Greek had ever seen, and he had wanted it all. What killed him? The question has occupied scholars for more than 2,000 years, and it remains genuinely unresolved. The most widely accepted modern hypothesis is typhoid fever, possibly complicated by a perforated bowel. Others have proposed West Nile encephalitis, endemic in the Babylon region. A minority have always considered deliberate poisoning. Perhaps the simplest answer is also the truest. He was a man who had spent 12 years at the absolute outer limit of what a human body could endure. He had outrun his own mortality for a remarkably long time. And then, one warm night in a palace in Babylon, it caught him. The world he had built began to fracture within hours. By dawn, his generals were already positioning themselves. Within 2 years, open war had broken out among the men who had wept beside his bed. No one ever came close to being Alexander. Lie very still now. Let the ancient city rest behind your eyes, the dark palm trees, the blue tiles of the Ishtar Gate, the Euphrates moving slowly south through the sleeping plain, carrying its brown water down toward the distant sea. The greatest conqueror in human history is gone. The world he made is already beginning to unmake itself. But the stars above Babylon are unchanged. They turn overhead, slow and indifferent and beautiful, just as they turned on every night of every campaign Alexander ever fought, every night he slept under the open sky somewhere between Greece and the edge of the world. And you are drifting now, softly and completely, down into the deep water of sleep. Let yourself go. The night is long, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest. There was a story told about Alexander and the philosopher Diogenes. It was years before Babylon, when Alexander was 20 and newly king and preparing to set out on his great campaign into Asia. He had gone to see Diogenes, who was famous throughout Greece, who lived in a barrel on the edge of the city and owned nothing and wanted nothing and was said to be the freest man alive. Alexander stood before the barrel and told Diogenes he could have anything, any gift, any favor, any honor that a king could bestow. Diogenes looked up at him and said, "Stand out of my sunlight." Alexander, who could have had Diogenes executed for this, laughed. He said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." He meant it. There was always, beneath the ambition and the energy and the relentless forward motion, a part of Alexander that was capable of recognizing what it cost. He had read Aristotle carefully. He understood the Stoic arguments about the limitations of conquest, about the difference between power and happiness, about what actually constitutes a good life. He understood them intellectually and then went ahead and did exactly what he would have done anyway. Let the image of that encounter rest in your mind for a moment. The young king, handsome and restless and full of the future, standing in the sunlight before the old philosopher in his barrel. The philosopher asking only that the shadow be moved. The king laughing and wishing he were someone else entirely. In Babylon, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, as the fever climbed and the days grew shorter, perhaps that story came back to him. Perhaps in the quiet hours of the long illness, with the sound of the fountain in the courtyard and the distant sound of the river, he thought about sunlight and shadows and what it might have been to want less than he had wanted. We cannot know. The ancient sources do not record what Alexander thought about in his last illness. They record the fever, the voice failing, the soldiers filing through, the generals at the bedside, the final word. The interior life, the private man behind the king, is lost to us entirely, as it is lost with almost everyone from the ancient world, where privacy was a concept that barely existed and the inner life was not considered a fit subject for historical record. What the sources do preserve is a detail, almost incidental, that appears in several accounts of the last days. When the doctors were at their most worried, sometime in the middle of the illness, they asked Alexander to cooperate with their treatments, to eat more, to rest more, to submit to the various procedures they believed would help. And Alexander refused, or complied only partially. Not dramatically, not in the heroic style of a man defying death. Quietly, as a man who is very tired and has decided to stop fighting something he cannot fight. This detail may be invented. The ancient sources are not reliable in the way modern historians require sources to be reliable. But it has the feel of something true. It fits what we know of the man, his practicality, his clear-eyed assessment of situations, his ability to look at a problem and see it whole without the protective distortion of wishful thinking. If he understood, by the middle of the illness, that this was not going to end the way his illnesses had always ended before, then perhaps the most honest thing he could do was to stop pretending otherwise. Let your breath slow and deepen. You are very comfortable. You are very safe. The night is long around you. The army waited outside Babylon's walls throughout those 11 days. 30,000 men in the dust, waiting for their king to recover as he had always recovered, waiting to march to Arabia and then wherever the march took them next. They had been waiting 11 years already, waiting for campaigns to end and begin again, waiting across mountains and deserts and rivers for the next battle, the next city, the next horizon. They had stopped asking, most of them, where they were going or when they would go home. Home had become an abstraction, something that existed in theory, the place where their families were and their fields, the cold winters and the rough wine of Macedon, the smell of pine forests. They had been away so long that home had become less real than this, the camp outside the walls of Babylon, the smell of the river, the voices of their companions, the person they had become over 11 years of marching and fighting beside the same men. And at the center of all of it was Alexander. His survival was their survival, in a sense that went beyond the merely practical. He was the reason they had come this far and done these things. He was the meaning that organized their experience. Without him, they were just men very far from home, in a foreign city, with no obvious reason to be there. This is why they wept. Let that rest in your mind as you breathe. The army outside the walls. The sun on the dust of the Babylonian plain. The men who had marched 22,000 miles standing still for the first time in years, unable to march their way out of this particular problem. On the 10th day of his illness, Alexander was moved once more, this time to the palace near the river. His doctors thought the air from the Euphrates might help, that the coolness that came off the water in the evening might ease the fever. The room they moved him to had a window that looked out directly onto the river. Through this window, in the last light of the afternoon, you could see the Euphrates moving south, slow and brown, carrying its load of silt down toward the Persian Gulf and eventually, thousands of miles away, to the sea. Alexander lay on his couch and looked at this view when his eyes were open. The ancient sources do not tell us what he thought when he looked at it. The river did not care. The river had been moving south before there was a Greece, before there was a Macedon, before there was a word for king. It would move south after the last trace of Alexander's empire was dust. It moved south now, indifferent and continuous, exactly as it had always moved. There is something both terrible and comforting about this, if you let it settle. The continuity of the world beyond any individual life. The river that keeps moving. The stars that keep turning. The city of Babylon that would, in fact, be abandoned within a century of Alexander's death, its walls crumbling, its gardens drying, its people moving away to the new cities the Greeks had built, the cities named Alexandria, the cities that were his monument whether he intended them as monuments or not. Breathe. Let the river move behind your eyes. Let the stars turn overhead. You are drifting now. The night is very deep and very quiet, and the story is almost done. Alexander had a habit, throughout his campaigns, of sleeping on the ground with his soldiers when they were on the march. Not always, not when there was a tent or a house available, but on many nights, and especially on the hardest nights, the ones after long force marches through difficult terrain when the army was exhausted and short of food and the ground was frozen. He would lie down in the dark among the thousands of sleeping men, wrapped in his cloak, and he would sleep as they slept, which meant not very well. His officers tried to discourage this. It was not safe, they argued. It was not appropriate for a king. There were always threats, always the possibility of assassination, always the risks that came with being the single most important person in a military enterprise. If something happened to Alexander, there was no one who could hold the army together, and the army knew it. Alexander listened to these arguments and then did what he wanted, as he almost always did. He slept on the ground with his soldiers because it was the kind of king he had decided to be from the very beginning, and he kept being that kind of king even when it was inconvenient. He ate what they ate when they were on short rations. He drank what they drank when the water was bad. He froze when they froze and sweated when they sweated and bled when they bled, or at least he was willing to. This is perhaps what the soldiers were remembering as they filed through his chamber in Babylon. Not the brilliant general, not the divine son of Zeus, not the conqueror of the world. Just the man who had slept on the ground beside them. The man whose face they had seen by firelight in a dozen countries, who had looked tired and cold and sometimes afraid, just like them. That man. That was the one they had come to see. Let your breathing settle into its slowest, most even rhythm now. You are very nearly in sleep. The ancient city is dark and quiet around you. The river moves. The stars turn. And somewhere in the vast flat dark of the Mesopotamian night, 30,000 men who once followed a king to the edge of the world are lying down in the dust, and most of them will not sleep tonight, and the ones who do sleep will dream of places they left a long time ago. The night is long. The night is very long. And you are drifting, quietly and completely, into the deep and dreamless dark. There is a place in Macedonia, in the mountains above the old capital of Pella, where the land is very high and very open, and on clear days you can see for 100 miles. The ancient Macedonians called it the roof of the world, though by any objective measure it is not the roof of the world, it is merely a high place in a corner of the Balkans, unremarkable except for the view. Alexander had gone there as a boy, with his father Philip, on a hunting trip. Philip had pointed south and east and told his son, "There is everything that is worth having, and it is waiting for someone to take it." Alexander was perhaps 12 years old. He had looked out over the enormous distance and felt something that he spent the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite managed. The nearest he came, in the accounts his companions later gave of his words, was this, that looking at the world from that high place, he had felt not that it was large but that it was his, not yet, not now, but inevitably, in the way that a name is inevitably yours even before you have grown into it. This feeling stayed with him his whole life. Every time he stood on a high place, on the walls of a captured city, on a ridge above a battlefield, on the deck of a ship watching the coast of a new continent rise from the sea, he felt it again. The world is mine, I am here to take it, and there is no upper limit to what taking it requires. In Babylon, at the end, lying on the couch with the fever and the failing voice and the 11 years of marching behind him, perhaps the feeling had changed. Perhaps the world no longer felt like something to be taken. Perhaps it had simply become very large, and very old, and entirely indifferent to the ambitions of 32-year-old kings, however extraordinary those kings might be. The river moved. The stars turned. Babylon breathed in the dark. And somewhere in the high mountains of Macedonia, on a clear day, you could still see for 100 miles, and there was nothing there that was waiting for anyone. It was just the world. It had always been just the world. Let that rest in you now, very gently, as you breathe. The river and the stars and the dark. The night is very nearly over, and you are very nearly asleep, and the ancient city rests in its silence, and you are drifting down, down, into the warm and peaceful dark of sleep. The palm trees in the garden of Nebuchadnezzar's palace were very old. They had been planted generations before Alexander arrived, tended by gardeners whose names no one remembered, watered by the channels that drew from the Euphrates in a system of irrigation so ancient that no one living could say who had designed it. The trees did not know they were in a famous garden. They did not know that Babylon was the greatest city in the world. They simply grew, as palms do, slowly, putting out new fronds each year while the old ones dried and fell, building their strange, shaggy trunks ring by ring, reaching upward toward the light with the patient indifference of things that have no choice about what they are. Alexander had sat under these palms during his illness, on the days when he was well enough to be moved to the garden. He had lain on his litter in their shade and looked up through the fronds at the sky, the deep blue Babylonian sky that was different from the sky over Macedon, different from the sky over Persia or India or Egypt, the same sky, but seen from a different angle, over different land, giving it a different quality. He had looked at this sky and breathed the warm air of the garden and listened to the fountain and to the palms moving slightly in the afternoon breeze, and on some of those afternoons he had perhaps simply rested. Not planned. Not decided. Not commanded. Just rested in the shade of old trees in an old garden in the oldest city in the world, and breathed, and been, briefly, only a man lying in a garden. The trees are gone now. The garden is gone. The palace is dust and the city is ruins and the river has changed its course over 2,000 years. But the sky over Babylon is still the same deep blue. The stars still come out at night in their thousands. The wind still moves across the flat Mesopotamian plain. And somewhere in all of that continuity is the echo of an afternoon in a garden, a man at rest, a breeze in the palms, the sound of a fountain. Let that rest in you now. You are breathing slowly and deeply. You are very nearly gone into sleep. The night holds you completely. Let go. And you are drifting now, softly and completely, down into the deep water of sleep. Let yourself go. The night is long, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavy and still against whatever surface holds you. The night is quiet around you, and you are safe, and the world is very far away. We are going to Rome. It is the night of March the 14th, in the year 44 BC, and the city is restless in its sleep. Rome in the 1st century BC is a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city in the Western world, a place of such density and noise and energy that the poet Juvenal will later complain that a man cannot sleep in Rome because of the constant rumble of cart wheels on the stone streets. The carts are banned from the streets during the day to ease the congestion, so they roll in from dusk to dawn, carrying grain and timber and wine and marble, and the sound they make is a continuous low thunder beneath the city's sleep. Tonight, though, there is something else beneath the noise of the carts. There is a tension that the people of Rome cannot quite name, a quality in the air like the feeling before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. Something is about to happen. The city feels it without knowing what it is. In a house on the Quirinal Hill, in the finest residential district of Rome, Julius Caesar is attending a dinner party. He is 55 years old. He is the most powerful man in the world. He holds the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, which means, in plain terms, that he rules Rome alone, without the traditional constraints of the republican constitution that had governed the city for centuries. He has recently returned from a string of military campaigns that carried Roman arms to Britain, Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Africa. He has reorganized the Roman calendar, the one we still use today, the Julian calendar, named for him, and he has plans, enormous plans, for the future of Rome and its empire. He is also, on this particular evening, in a thoughtful mood. The dinner is hosted by Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, one of his senior officers and close political allies, and the conversation has taken a philosophical turn. The guests are discussing death, not morbidly, but as a serious topic of inquiry, in the Stoic tradition that educated Romans had absorbed. What is the best kind of death? How should a man wish to die? Caesar, when asked, answers without hesitation, suddenly. Without warning. A death that arrives without time for anticipation, for fear, for the long deterioration that age brings. This is the death he would choose. A swift death, unexpected, clean. In less than 18 hours, he will get exactly what he asked for. But let us slow down. Let us stay in this room for a moment, the candlelit dining room of Lepidus's house, the couches arranged around the low table in the Roman fashion, the servants moving quietly with wine and food, the faces of the guests illuminated by the warm light. Caesar is reclining on his couch, his toga arranged with the casual precision of a man who has worn formal dress all his adult life. He is thin, he was always thin, and in recent years he has become thinner still, something wrong with his digestion that the doctors cannot entirely fix. His face is lined, but his eyes are sharp and dark and deeply attentive. He listens to the conversation around him with the total focus of a man who has spent his life extracting useful information from whatever room he is in. He does not know that 23 of his closest associates, men he trusted and promoted and saved from earlier disgrace, are at this very moment gathered in a private room elsewhere in the city, rehearsing tomorrow's plan in low and urgent voices. Rest for a moment. Let your breath move in and out slowly. Let the candlelit room rest behind your eyes. The low table. The wine. The philosophical conversation about what constitutes a good death. After dinner, Caesar returned to his house on the Via Sacra. His wife Calpurnia was there, and she was in a state of quiet anxiety. She had always been somewhat superstitious, most Romans were, and in the past several days there had been a series of events that she could not dismiss. The night before, she had dreamed that the pediment of their house had collapsed, and that Caesar lay bleeding in her arms. She had woken from this dream in the dark hours before dawn, shaking. She had not told Caesar immediately. She knew how he responded to warnings, which was to acknowledge them with courtesy and then proceed exactly as planned. But the dream had stayed with her all day, vivid and wrong, feeling in the way of dreams that seem more like prophecy than imagination. That evening, she told him. Caesar listened to her describe the dream. He listened to her fears about the following day. He was scheduled to appear at the Senate, at a meeting that had been called specifically for March the 15th, the Ides of March. He listened, and he was not dismissive. He loved Calpurnia, in his way, and he took omens seriously, as all Romans did. He agreed that he would not go to the Senate the following day. He would send word that he was unwell. For a brief moment, history held its breath. Let the quiet of this moment settle around you. The house on the Via Sacra in the deep of the Roman night. Caesar agreeing, for once, to be cautious. Calpurnia's relief, temporary and fragile as glass. And then Decimus Brutus arrived. Decimus Brutus was different from the more famous Marcus Junius Brutus. Decimus was Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, a man who had fought beside him in Gaul for years, who owed his entire career to Caesar's patronage. He was also one of the 23 conspirators. Decimus had been sent specifically to fetch Caesar. The conspirators had learned that Caesar intended to stay home, and they were alarmed. They had planned everything for the following day, and a postponement might give them time to lose their nerve, or give Caesar time to learn of the plot. Decimus was chosen as the messenger because Caesar trusted him utterly. Decimus came to the house and said what he had been instructed to say. He made light of Calpurnia's dreams. He suggested that the Senate would think Caesar was mocking them if he stayed home. He reminded Caesar that there was talk of a proposal to crown him king of the eastern provinces, a proposal that had been arranged to be made at this very meeting. If Caesar did not come, the moment would pass. Caesar was persuaded. He rose, and called for his litter, and prepared to go to the Senate. Calpurnia watched him go. The sources do not tell us what she said, or whether she said anything at all. They record only that she wept. Breathe slowly. You are safe and still. The night holds you gently. The morning of the Ides of March was unremarkable in its first hours, a Roman morning like any other, the streets gradually filling with people, the smell of bread baking in the bakeries near the Forum, the sound of the city beginning its daily business. Caesar's litter moved through the streets toward the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day because the Senate house was under renovation. Along the way, a man pressed a note into Caesar's hand. The note contained the names of the conspirators and a description of their plan. Caesar held the note in his closed fist throughout the journey, intending to read it when he arrived, then found himself immediately surrounded by men with business to discuss. He never read it. He also passed, somewhere near the Forum, the soothsayer who had warned him at the beginning of the year to beware the Ides of March. Caesar reportedly called out to the man that the Ides had come. The soothsayer answered, "They have come, but they have not yet gone." Caesar entered the hall. The senators rose to their feet in the traditional gesture of respect. And then, before he could even take his seat on the ivory chair that had been placed for him on the dais, the men began to close in around him. The first cut came from Casca, who struck at Caesar's neck from behind. Caesar grabbed his arm and turned, and in that turning he saw what was happening, the ring of men around him, their togas pulled back, the daggers they had hidden beneath them. He fought. He was a soldier, and old instincts are not easily suppressed, and he fought them with the only weapons he had, his hands and his stylus, and he was 60 years old and alone against 23. He received 23 wounds. The ancient sources disagree about which was fatal. A later physician who examined the body concluded that most of the wounds were not in themselves mortal, and that only one, a wound to his chest, had been lethal. The others were the work of men who were frightened and inexperienced and needed, each of them, to have a share in what they had decided to do. At some point in the struggle, Caesar stopped fighting. The sources disagree about why. Some say he lost consciousness from blood loss. Some say he saw Marcus Brutus among the conspirators and was so shocked by the presence of a man he had trusted completely that he ceased to resist. The famous words, "it too, brute," come from Shakespeare, not from the ancient sources, though the emotion they describe is true to what the sources suggest Caesar felt in that last moment. He pulled his toga over his face, and he fell at the base of Pompey's statue, and he died. Let that image rest softly in your mind. The man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had conquered Gaul, who had reformed the calendar and reorganized the Roman world, lying still at last, at the foot of a statue of his great rival, in a room full of men who were already beginning to understand that they had not thought through what came next. The senators fled. They ran into the streets of Rome in their blood-stained togas, and the people of the city saw them and did not understand what had happened. The assassins had imagined that the death of Caesar would be greeted with celebration. They had convinced themselves that the Roman people longed for the return of the Republic, and would welcome those who had freed them from dictatorship. Instead, the people of Rome looked at the senators running through the streets and felt only fear and confusion. Within days, Mark Antony's speech at Caesar's funeral would turn the people against the conspirators. Within months, Marcus Brutus and Cassius would be driven from Rome. Within 3 years, both would be dead. Within 13 years, the republic the conspirators had killed Caesar to save would be gone entirely, replaced by something even less republican than what Caesar had built, an empire, with a single emperor, the man the ancient sources would call Augustus, Caesar's adopted son. Everything the conspirators had feared came to pass. Everything they had killed Caesar to prevent happened anyway, only worse. Let your body grow heavy now. Let the city of Rome fade behind your eyes, the stone streets, the forum in the pale morning light, the empty chair on the dais where Caesar never sat a day. The night has grown very deep, and you are very nearly asleep. Caesar had wanted a swift death, unexpected, without time for fear. In the end, he got it, the last thing he ever asked for. Whether he got it in the way he imagined, whether the last seconds in that room were swift or terribly long, whether he was afraid or simply surprised, we cannot know. The ancient sources are silent on what a man experiences in the last moments of his life. What they tell us is that afterward, 3 slaves carried his body home to Calpurnia, one arm hanging down from the litter as they walked. And that she waited for him in the house on the Via Sacra, as she had waited for him through campaigns in Gaul and Britain and Egypt and Africa, through all the years of his power and his absence. And that she had known, from the moment of her dream, what the morning would bring. Lie still now. Let the warm dark of the Roman night settle around you. The carts are rolling on the stone street somewhere below, carrying their loads through the sleeping city. The stars are out over the 7 hills. And somewhere in a house on the Via Sacra, a woman is sitting in a room lit by a single lamp, waiting for a husband who will not come home. You are drifting down into sleep now, quietly and completely. The night is long, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest. The conspiracy against Julius Caesar had been growing for months, fed by fear and wounded pride and genuine political conviction in proportions that varied by conspirator. Some of the men involved were Caesarians, men who had served under Caesar, whom Caesar had promoted and forgiven and trusted, and their betrayal had the particular bitterness of apostasy, of men who had believed something and then stopped believing it, or who had believed in the man but not in what the man was becoming. Marcus Junius Brutus is the most discussed of them, the one who has attracted the most historical and literary attention across the centuries since. He was 41 years old, the son of a woman named Servilia who had for years been Caesar's lover, which made the relationship between Brutus and Caesar more complicated than the simple patron and client it appeared to be. Caesar had, in fact, treated Brutus with something that looked a great deal like favoritism, had spared his life after the Battle of Pharsalus when Brutus had fought on the wrong side, had promoted him, had trusted him with important administrative positions. Why did Brutus join the conspiracy? The ancient sources give multiple answers and they may all be partially true. He believed, or convinced himself that he believed, that Caesar intended to make himself king, to formalize the monarchical reality of what was already happening, to take the final step from dictator to king that would end the Roman Republic entirely. Brutus came from a family with a complicated relationship to the idea of kings. His ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus had, according to Roman tradition, expelled the last king of Rome 5 centuries before and founded the Republic. The name Brutus meant something. It carried an obligation that Brutus may have felt he could not refuse. He also had the example of his father-in-law Cato, who had killed himself rather than live under Caesar's rule, and who had become, in death, the icon of Republican resistance, the man who chose death over compromise. Cato's shadow lay over Brutus's life. Living up to Cato, or at least not falling too obviously short of him, was a persistent pressure. And there was Cassius. Gaius Cassius Longinus was Brutus's brother-in-law and the driving force of the conspiracy. He was a brilliant military man who had saved what remained of the Roman force in the east after Crassus's disaster at Carrhae, who had fought effectively against Caesar during the civil war, and who had been pardoned by Caesar afterward, a fact that apparently rankled rather than obligated. Cassius had what the ancient sources describe as a lean and hungry look, and his motives for wanting Caesar dead were mixed enough to make even the most sympathetic reader uncomfortable. He didn't like kings. He also didn't like Caesar specifically, with a personal intensity that went beyond political principle. It was Cassius who first approached Brutus. It was Cassius who organized the meetings, who recruited the other conspirators, who kept the plan from falling apart during the weeks of planning. And it was Cassius who had to argue Brutus into a decision that Brutus clearly found profoundly difficult. Let your breathing slow. You are very comfortable. The night is deep and still around you. On the evening before the Ides, while Caesar was attending the dinner at Lepidus's house and discussing the best kind of death, Brutus was at home. He was not sleeping. He had not been sleeping well for weeks, for the obvious reasons. He walked through his house in the dark, his own rooms, the garden, the library, turning the thing over and over in his mind the way you turn a stone over to see what is underneath, and finding nothing underneath it that made him feel certain. He believed in the Republic. He believed Caesar was destroying it. He believed that someone had to stop Caesar, and that the only way to stop him was to kill him, and that if someone had to do it, it should be done by men who genuinely believed in Republican principles rather than men who simply wanted Caesar's power for themselves. These were the reasons he had said yes to Cassius. But belief is not the same as certainty, and certainty is not the same as peace, and Brutus, walking through his house in the dark, had none of the three. He thought about Caesar. He thought about the specific Caesar he knew, not the dictator, the political problem, the abstract threat to Republican principles, but the actual man. He thought about the occasion Caesar had shown him kindness, the genuine kindness that was not merely strategic but seemed to come from something real in the man's character. He thought about how Caesar's eyes had looked when they talked, with the particular attention Caesar gave to people he actually liked. And then he thought about Cato, and the Republic, and what he owed to his name and to his city, and he tried to be Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had expelled a king and put principle above every personal consideration. He tried very hard to be that man. We don't know if he succeeded. The ancient sources preserve the outcome but not the interior of the night before. Let that rest in your mind. The house in Rome. The dark garden. The man pacing in the dark, trying to become the person the situation required him to be. In another part of the city, Cassius was making final preparations. The other conspirators had been informed of the plan in pieces, each told only what they needed to know. 23 men altogether, which was already more than was safe. Every additional person increased the risk of a leak. They had met several times in small groups, rehearsed the basic sequence of events, agreed on who would strike first. The plan was simple, which was its strength. Complex plans failed when the unexpected happened. Simple plans had fewer points of failure. On the morning of the Ides, the conspirators gathered at the house of one of their number and went together to the theatre of Pompey. They wore their togas with the daggers hidden beneath, in the traditional fashion of Roman senators attending a formal session. Nothing about their appearance would have raised suspicion. They were simply senators on their way to work. Except that each of them knew what was in the folds of his toga. Breathe. Let the Roman morning come back for a moment, the light on the stone streets, the smell of the bread in the bakeries, the ordinary city beginning its ordinary day while underneath the surface something irreversible was about to happen. The theatre of Pompey was a great complex of buildings in the Campus Martius, built by Pompey the Great from the spoils of his eastern campaigns. At its center was the theatre itself, which could hold thousands of spectators. Adjoining it were various rooms and colonnades, and it was in one of these rooms, the Curia of Pompey, which served as a meeting place when the Senate House itself was unavailable, that the Senate would meet on March the 15th. Caesar arrived by litter, carried through the streets as was customary for a man of his rank and age. The crowds parted for him, as they always parted. The senators at the entrance bowed in the formal manner, as they always bowed. Everything looked exactly as it always looked. The conspirators were already in the room. They had positioned themselves around the space with care, some near the dais where Caesar would sit, some by the exits, some in the middle of the room where they could move quickly in any direction. Anyone watching would have seen only senators finding seats. Caesar entered and moved toward the dais. And then Tullius Cimber stepped forward. He had a petition, a request for the pardon of his exiled brother, that he had mentioned to Caesar before and that Caesar had, he claimed, agreed to consider. He pressed the petition on Caesar now, urgently, gesturing and speaking in the too emphatic way of a man who is nervous and covering it with energy. Caesar tried to wave him away. Cimber grabbed his toga. This was the signal. The others moved. Casca, who had positioned himself behind Caesar, struck first, a cut at Caesar's neck from behind, angled downward. Caesar felt the blow and turned and grabbed Casca's arm. Other daggers were already moving. Caesar fought. He was a soldier and he was not old and he was not easy to kill quickly. He turned and struggled and was cut repeatedly, and the sounds in that room, the shouts, the movement, the particular sounds of a man fighting and being overwhelmed, echoed in the marble space and were heard by the senators who were not part of the conspiracy, who understood almost immediately what was happening and were already backing toward the exits. 23 wounds. Not all of them were aimed carefully. Some were glancing. Some struck other conspirators who were pressing too close. The post-mortem examination, conducted later by a physician named Antistius, found that only the second chest wound was in itself lethal. At some point, Caesar stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head, and he fell at the base of the statue of Pompey, and he died in the shadow of the man who had been his greatest rival and whom he had defeated and who had been killed, in turn, on the shores of Egypt 3 years before. The statue of Pompey stood over Caesar's body. The senators who were not conspirators had fled. The conspirators stood in the empty room with their daggers and their blood-stained togas, and the reality of what they had done was settling over them, and it was not what they had imagined. Let the quiet of that room rest in your mind. The marble floor. The overturned chair. The statue. The body. The conspirators standing in the silence, realizing that they had thought a great deal about how to kill Caesar and almost nothing about what would happen after. They had imagined the people of Rome rising in relief and gratitude. They had imagined the Republic restored, the constitutional norms reasserting themselves naturally, the way things snap back into shape when the force holding them in distortion is removed. They had imagined Rome saying, "Yes, this is what we wanted. Thank you." Instead, the people of Rome were frightened and confused, the soldiers of Caesar's armies were angry, and Mark Antony, Caesar's colleague and the most capable politician in Rome, was already thinking about how to use this moment to his own advantage. The Republic would not be restored. The Republic was already past restoring. The conspirators had killed the man without understanding the conditions that had made him possible, and those conditions had not changed. You are very nearly asleep. Let the city of Rome fade around you. Let the long day of the Ides of March recede into the past where it belongs. Caesar's body lay at the base of Pompey's statue for several hours before anyone came to collect it. Eventually 3 of his slaves carried him home on a litter. Calpurnia had spent the day in the house on the Via Sacra, unable to eat, unable to do anything but wait and hear the rumors that came in through the slaves who moved through the city. She heard what had happened before the litter arrived. She was standing at the door when the slaves carried her husband through it. What she felt in that moment, the ancient sources do not record. They were not interested in Calpurnia's feelings. They were interested in Caesar's last words and Caesar's wounds and what it meant for the Republic and the future of Rome. Calpurnia's grief was a private thing, and it stayed private, and it is lost. Lie still now. Let the stars turn above the 7 hills of Rome. Let the Tiber move in the dark between its banks. The night is very long and very quiet, and you are drifting down into sleep, gently and completely, and there is nothing left to do but rest. There is a question that has been asked about Caesar for 2,000 years, and it has never been satisfactorily answered. Did he want to be king? The conspirators were certain he did. The title of Dictator Perpetuo was, they argued, effectively the same thing. The statues being raised to him in the temples, the cult of personality being built around him, the coin that bore his portrait, all of these were the preparations of a man who intended to make his power formal and hereditary. The story of Mark Antony offering Caesar a crown at the Lupercalia festival, just weeks before the Ides, and Caesar declining it publicly while his partisans cheered for him to accept it, this story, which everyone knew, was the clearest evidence of what was being planned. The offer would come again. Next time, Caesar would not decline. Caesar himself never said clearly whether he wanted the title of king. He was too careful a politician to say it, and he would have known that saying it was more dangerous than the reality. The Romans had a deep, almost irrational revulsion toward the word king, rex in Latin, that went back to the tradition of Lucius Junius Brutus and the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus. You could have all the power of a king and be tolerated. You could call yourself dictator and be tolerated. You could not call yourself rex and survive. So Caesar was silent on the question, and remained silent forever after March the 15th, and the question has no answer. What we can say is that Caesar was a man of extraordinary political intelligence who had spent his entire adult life understanding power, where it came from, how it was consolidated, what it required and what it cost. He had watched Sulla, the dictator before him, and Pompey, his greatest rival. He had understood, from his earliest years in politics, that the Roman Republic was not working, that the institutions designed for a city-state were inadequate to governing an empire, that the Senate's collective leadership was producing paralysis and corruption and civil war, that what Rome needed was something more efficient and more stable than what it had. He was probably right about this. History supports him. After his death, after the chaos and civil war that followed, Rome did eventually get the kind of government it needed, in the form of Augustus's Principate. A single executive, effectively a monarch, dressed in the language of the Republic and calling himself not king but first citizen. The thing Caesar was suspected of wanting came into being anyway, 17 years after his death. He was too early. That was all. He was trying to make a change that needed to happen, but he was trying to make it while the people who would benefit from it still believed in the old order. They were not ready. They killed him. This is the cold historical logic of his death. It doesn't make him right and his killers wrong, or wrong and his killers right. It makes it a tragedy in the precise sense, a story in which everyone is doing what seems necessary and correct to them, and the result is disaster for all of them. Let that settle quietly in your mind as you breathe. The slow turn of history. The cold logic. The night falling over Rome, over the hills, over the city of 1 million people who do not yet know what they have lost or what they have gained or what will come next. You are very nearly asleep. The night is deep and warm and still. Let it carry you the rest of the way down. Calpurnia kept the letters. This is something that the ancient sources mention only in passing, almost as an afterthought, that after Caesar's death, when Mark Antony came to the house on the Via Sacra to collect Caesar's papers and his will, Calpurnia gave over the official documents and the political correspondence and kept everything else, which included the private letters that Caesar had written to her over the years of their marriage. These were not historically significant. They were not the letters of state that historians would later want to examine. They were the letters of a man to his wife, brief, often, because he was always busy and always pressed for time, but real in the way that only truly private writing is real, without the performance that attended everything else Caesar wrote. She kept them for the rest of her life. We do not know how long she lived after March the 15th. The ancient sources lose interest in her almost immediately after Caesar's death, and she disappears from the record. We do not know what the letters said. They have not survived 2,000 years. But she kept them, and that fact tells us something about what the marriage was, beneath the politics and the power and the philosophical dinner party conversations about the best way to die. It tells us that there was a man inside the dictator, and a marriage inside the alliance, and a private life inside the public life, and that Calpurnia had known all of these things and had loved them, in the way that it is possible to love a complicated person without approving of everything they do or agreeing with everything they believe. The house on the Via Sacra. The lamp burning in the window. The letters in their box. The night very long around you now, warm and still, carrying you gently down into sleep. You are safe. You are completely at rest. Let the darkness take you, softly and entirely, into the deep and dreamless quiet. The Forum Romanum, in the days after the Ides, was a strange and charged place. People moved through it quickly, not stopping to talk in the usual way, not gathering in the groups that ordinarily formed around the law courts and the temples and the rostra where orators spoke. There was a quality of held breath in the air, a sense that everyone was waiting for something to happen, not knowing what it would be or from which direction it would come. The senators who had fled the scene of Caesar's murder had gone home and barricaded their doors. The conspirators had retreated to the Capitoline Hill and were trying to decide what to do next. Caesar's body lay in the house on the Via Sacra. The city did not know yet what it felt, or what it was supposed to feel, or what would come of what had happened. Mark Antony, moving through this uncertainty with the sure-footed instinct of a man who understood people in the mass, saw his opportunity. He had Caesar's body brought to the Forum. He had the funeral in the Forum, which was unusual and required senatorial permission that he obtained through a combination of argument and implied threat. He had Caesar's will read publicly, which revealed that Caesar had left a sum of money to every citizen of Rome, an ordinary person's annual income, a gift that had been planned apparently for some time. And then he spoke. The speech Mark Antony gave at Caesar's funeral is one of the most famous in history, partly because of Shakespeare's version of it and partly because of what it accomplished. He did not attack the conspirators directly. He read the list of honors the Senate had voted Caesar, the same honors the conspirators had used as evidence of his tyrannical ambitions, and after each one he paused and said, "And Brutus says he was ambitious." Repetition, used with perfect timing. The crowd, which had come to the funeral with mixed feelings, which had been prepared to accept the conspirators' narrative, began to change. By the end of the speech, the Forum was in uproar. People tore apart the benches and the market stalls and built a pyre in the Forum and burned Caesar's body there. The conspirators fled Rome within days. The republic they had killed Caesar to save was finished. Let the Forum grow quiet in your mind now. The embers of the pyre. The night coming down over Rome. The river running in the dark below the 7 hills. You are breathing very slowly. You are almost gone. The night is warm and complete and it holds you, and there is nothing left, nothing at all, but sleep. You are drifting down into sleep now, quietly and completely. The night is long, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the world fall away from you now. Let your thoughts slow and scatter like leaves on still water. You are safe. You are comfortable. There is nothing required of you in this moment but to breathe and listen and let the night carry you gently down into sleep. Tonight we are going to an island. It is a small island, far out in the South Atlantic Ocean, so remote that when the British chose it as a prison for the most dangerous man in Europe, they did so precisely because of its remoteness, because from this island, there was nowhere to escape to. The nearest mainland is 1,500 miles away. The sea around the island is rough and cold and patrolled by British warships. The island is called St. Helena. The year is 1821, and spring is turning towards summer in the southern hemisphere, which means the days are growing shorter and the nights longer, and the wind that comes off the South Atlantic carries a chill that settles into the bones of anyone who has spent too long on this island. In a house called Longwood, which sits on a plateau in the center of the island where the wind blows hardest and the damp is most persistent, a man is dying. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He is 51 years old. He was once Emperor of France, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, Mediator of the Swiss Confederation, and the effective master of an empire stretching from Portugal to Poland, from the North Sea to the borders of Russia. He had won more major battles than any commander in European history. He had rewritten the legal codes of France in a document still in use today, still called the Napoleonic Code. He had reorganized the French education system, the banking system, the administrative structure of the state. He had also, in 1812, led 600,000 men into Russia and come back with fewer than 100,000. He had been defeated at Waterloo in 1815, after 100 days of his return from an earlier exile, and this time the British had taken no chances. They had sent him here, to this windy island in the middle of nothing, with a small court of loyal followers and a British governor who watched his every move. He has been here 6 years now. And something in the island, the damp, the wind, the confinement, the slow grinding frustration of a man of enormous energy with nothing to do and nowhere to go, something has gotten into him and is slowly taking him apart. Let your breathing slow. Let the image of the island settle in your mind, the grey sky, the Atlantic wind bending the sparse trees on the plateau, the lights of Longwood House visible from the sea as a small warm glow in the darkness. Inside Longwood, in the room he has made his study, Napoleon is awake. He is often awake in the night now. Sleep comes badly and departs early, leaving him in the dark with his thoughts and the sound of the wind and the distant sound of the sea. He gets up, sometimes, and paces the room in his dressing gown. He was always a pacer, always moved when he thought, always worked better standing than sitting. But the room at Longwood is not large, and the pacing is circumscribed, and sometimes he stops in the middle of the room and stands still for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at nothing. On the table in his study are spread the papers of his memoirs. This has been his great project in exile, to tell his own story, on his own terms, before history has a chance to tell it for him. He has dictated to his secretaries for hours every day, sometimes for 6 or 8 hours at a stretch, ranging over the campaigns and the political decisions and the personalities of the men around him, shaping the narrative of his life into something that will, he hopes, outlast the verdict of his enemies. He is aware, with the clear eyes of a man who has always been more honest with himself than he lets on, that he will not be judged well by the immediate verdict of history. He has caused too much destruction, spent too many lives, left too many countries impoverished and grieving. But he believes, and the belief sustains him through the long days and the longer nights, that a later judgment will be different. That when the dust settles and the bitterness fades, men will see what he actually accomplished. The law, the administration, the careers he made possible for men of talent, regardless of birth. The France he transformed from an exhausted revolutionary state into a modern nation. He picks up a page from the table and reads what he dictated yesterday, moving his lips slightly as he reads, in the habit of a man who learned to read in a second language. His first language is Corsican Italian. He came to French relatively late, and always retained a slight accent, a slight roughness at the edges of the language, that his enemies used to mock him and that his admirers found endearing. He sets the page down and looks at the window. Outside, the wind is moving the curtain slightly, and through the gap he can see a strip of night sky, overcast, no stars visible. On clear nights he can sometimes see stars, and on those nights he often stands at the window for a long time, looking up, because the night sky over St. Helena is extraordinary. Far from any city, deep in the southern hemisphere, you can see stars here that are not visible from Europe, and the Milky Way is bright enough to cast a faint shadow. But tonight the sky is covered, and there is only the wind and the darkness and the distant sound of the Atlantic. Breathe slowly. Let the sound of the wind rest in your mind. The island in the dark ocean. The lamplit room. The papers on the table. His physician, a Corsican named Francesco Antomarchi, does his best with what he has, but he is young and somewhat inexperienced, and clearly out of his depth with whatever is happening to his patient. The diagnosis is debated even now. 2 centuries later, stomach cancer is the most widely accepted explanation, supported by the post-mortem evidence. Some historians have argued for arsenic poisoning, either deliberate or accidental, based on later analysis of hair samples. Napoleon himself believed that it was the climate of St. Helena that was killing him, the damp, the cold wind, the island itself, and that if he had been allowed to go somewhere warmer, somewhere drier, he would have recovered. He may have been right. He may have been wrong. The truth, as with so many things about this man, is genuinely uncertain even 2 centuries later. What is certain is that he has been in pain for months now, pain in his stomach and his side that the doctors treat with whatever remedies they have available, which are not much. He has lost weight dramatically. His face, which was always round and pale, has become thin, the features more prominent, the eyes deeper in their sockets. Tonight he thinks about his son. The boy is 10 years old now. His name, given at birth with the full weight of imperial expectation, is Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles Bonaparte, King of Rome. He was 2 years old when Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, and he has been living in Vienna since then, at the court of his maternal grandfather, the Emperor of Austria, who has renamed him Franz and is raising him as an Austrian. Napoleon writes letters to the boy, knowing that most of them are intercepted and never delivered. He writes them anyway. He has not seen his son in 6 years. He will not see him again. Let that rest gently in your mind. The man who commanded the armies of Europe, sitting alone in a lamplit room on a remote island, writing letters to a child who will grow up not knowing him. Sometime in the night, Napoleon's attendant Marchand comes to check on him. Marchand has been with Napoleon since the first exile, and he is one of the small number of people Napoleon genuinely trusts. He enters quietly, sees that Napoleon is awake, and asks if he needs anything. Napoleon says he is cold. Marchand brings another blanket and arranges it over the man who once heated half of Europe with the fires of war. Napoleon accepts the blanket without comment. He has become, in these last months, somewhat quieter than he was. The famous energy, the relentless forward movement that had characterized everything he did from the age of 25 onward, has slowed. He is still capable of bursts of the old brilliance, his mind still moves quickly, he still has opinions about everything and expresses them with force and clarity. But there are long intervals now between these bursts, intervals when he sits quietly and looks at nothing and does not speak. Marchand adjusts the blanket and says good night and withdraws, and Napoleon is alone again with the wind and the papers and the darkness. He thinks about Waterloo. He thinks about it often. He has written about it extensively in his memoirs, analyzing the decisions made and not made, the timing of Groucho's movements, the arrival of Prussian reinforcements at the critical moment, the inexplicable hesitation in the morning's attack that gave Wellington time to consolidate his position on the ridge. He has an explanation for everything, and the explanation is never simply that he was beaten by a better general on that day. The explanations involve bad luck and bad subordinates and the intervention of historical forces beyond any individual's control. Whether he believes these explanations entirely, only Napoleon knows. Breathe. Let your body sink deeper into rest. You are very comfortable and very safe, and the night is long. In the early hours of the morning, Napoleon falls into something that is not quite sleep, a heavy, troubled half-consciousness in which he is aware of the room around him but also somewhere else, somewhere in the past. He is back in Italy, in 1796, a young general of 26 leading an army of starving, poorly equipped French soldiers against the far superior Austrian forces. He is moving through the mountains at night, his troops struggling with the terrain and the cold, and he is feeling the thing he could never adequately describe to anyone who had not felt it themselves, the sense of complete, crystalline clarity that came to him in the middle of a battle, when the noise and chaos and danger somehow resolved themselves into perfect comprehensibility, when he could see the entire field as if from above, when he knew exactly where to strike and when and with how much force. He misses that more than he misses power, more than he misses Paris, more than he misses any of the people he has loved and lost. He misses the feeling of his own mind working at full capacity in conditions that required everything it had. He surfaces from the half-dream slowly, and the room comes back around him, the longward study, the wind, the papers, the lamp burning low. April passes into early May. Napoleon's condition deteriorates steadily. He can no longer walk without assistance. He spends most of his time in bed, his attendants around him, the doctor coming and going several times a day. He is lucid in the mornings and confused in the afternoons, and the confusion is harder to witness than the physical decline for those around him who have known the sharpness of his mind. On the 3rd of May, he receives the last rites of the Catholic Church from his chaplain. Napoleon was not, by nature, a deeply religious man. He had used religion as a political tool for most of his career, understanding its power over populations without entirely sharing it himself. But he was raised Catholic, and in these final weeks something has softened in him on this subject, and he receives the sacrament with what appears to be genuine feeling. On the 4th of May, he gives his final instructions to his attendants. He has thought about what he wants said at his burial, what possessions he wants distributed to whom. He wants his heart, he says, to be sent to Marie-Louise, his second wife, the mother of his son. He wants to be buried in France, on the banks of the Seine, among the people he loved. He knows the British will not allow this, and that he will be buried here, on this island, far from everything he knew. He issues these instructions with the calm precision of a man who has given orders all his life and knows that this is the last time. Let yourself go quiet now. Let your thoughts slow to almost nothing. The night is very deep and very warm around you, and you are very nearly asleep. On the 5th of May, 1821, at 17 minutes to 6 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died at Longwood House on the island of St. Helena, surrounded by the small court of loyal followers who had chosen exile with him rather than comfort without him. His last words, as recorded by those present, were France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Josephine. France. The army. Head of the army. Josephine, the name of his first wife, the woman he had divorced for political reasons and who had died 7 years before him, and whose name, it seems, was the last thing his mind reached for at the end. He was 51 years old. He had risen from a middle-class family in Corsica to rule an empire of 70 million people. He had fought in more than 60 battles. He had won 50. He had lost, most importantly, 2. 19 years after his death, the British government relented and allowed his remains to be taken to France. He was buried in the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, in a tomb of red porphyry set into the floor of a great circular crypt, and to this day people come from all over the world to stand at the edge of that crypt and look down at the name on the stone, Napoleon. Just the one name. He earned the right to need only one. Rest now. Let the island fall away, the wind, the grey sky, the Atlantic waves breaking on the rocky shore far below Longwood House. Let the lamplit room fade. Let the papers on the table fade too. You are very nearly asleep. The night is long and still around you. Somewhere, very far away, the ocean moves. The stars, on the nights when the sky is clear, are extraordinary over that remote island. And the man who once set Europe on fire is at rest at last, beneath the red stone in Paris, and the world has been arguing about him ever since, and will never stop. Let yourself go. You are safe and still, and the night holds you gently. There is nothing left to do but sleep. In the years before St. Helena, there had been a night that Napoleon returned to often in his memory. It was in December of 1804, the night before his coronation as Emperor of France, and he had lain awake in the Tuileries Palace listening to the sound of Paris outside his window, the city still celebrating, still lit with bonfires and torches, the bells of Notre Dame still ringing from the afternoon ceremony, and he had felt something that he struggled, even later, to describe accurately. Not happiness, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter and stranger, the particular silence that exists at the top of a mountain, the moment after you have arrived at the place you were climbing toward and the climbing has stopped and you are standing there, and the view is extraordinary, and you realize that the climbing was, in some way, the point, and that now you will have to begin the long descent. He was 35. He had been climbing for his entire adult life. He had arrived, and the silence at the top was not what he expected. He thought about this on St. Helena more than he thought about Waterloo, though he thought about Waterloo constantly. The coronation night came back to him as a reference point, a moment of maximum achievement against which everything that followed could be measured, and by that measure everything that followed was decline. Breathe slowly. Let the images settle and drift. You are very comfortable and very still. The years between the coronation and Waterloo were, by any external measure, extraordinary. The empire expanded. The legal codes were written and implemented. The roads were built. The educational system was reorganized. The Bank of France was stabilized. The Concordat with the Pope was negotiated. The battles of Austerlitz and Jena and Wagram and a dozen others were fought and won. The map of Europe was redrawn again, and each redrawing had Napoleon's hand in it. And underneath all of it, always, the climbing feeling. The sense that there was always more to be done, more to be secured, more to be won, more to be justified. The empire was never quite stable enough, the borders were never quite safe enough, the allies were never quite reliable enough. There was always a threat, always a reason to campaign one more year, always a reason not yet to stop. Russia was where the climbing stopped. He made the decision in 1812 with the full knowledge that it was dangerous. He was not deluded about the risks. He knew the distances involved, the difficulty of supply lines across such terrain, the unpredictability of the Russian winter. He had advisors who told him, directly, that this was not a war that could be won quickly, and that a war with Russia that was not won quickly was a war that was probably not won at all. He listened to them, thanked them, and proceeded. Why? There are explanations: the continental blockade that required Russian cooperation, the political pressures that made confrontation seem inevitable, the strategic logic of eliminating the last major power capable of threatening French dominance. These explanations are real and they are not wrong. But they are also not quite sufficient, and Napoleon knew it, and said as much in his memoirs on St. Helena. What the memoirs hint at, without quite saying, is something simpler, that he had been moving forward for 20 years and he did not know how to stop. That the momentum was its own force, requiring its own resolution, and that the resolution had to be a campaign larger than any that had come before, because the one before had been larger than the one before that, and the logic of escalation was built into the enterprise from the beginning. Let your breathing slow even further now. Let the images of the Russian plains drift behind your eyes, the vast pale sky, the endless forests, the snow that began to fall in October and did not stop. The retreat from Moscow lasted 5 months. 600,000 men had gone into Russia. Perhaps 100,000 came back, and those who came back were changed in ways that went beyond physical damage. They had seen something that the human mind was not built to process: the systematic destruction of a civilization by its own people, the burning of Moscow before the French arrived, the empty city, the fires. And then the retreat, and the cold, and the hunger, and the river crossings under artillery fire, and the men who fell and did not get up and were left in the snow. Napoleon rode among them throughout the retreat. He saw what they saw. He was not a man who protected himself from the consequences of his decisions. This was one of his genuine qualities. He looked at the results of what he had done and he did not look away. He looked at it, and he turned it, and he filed it in the part of his mind where the analysis was kept, and he kept moving. He had to. There was still France to defend, still enemies closing from every direction, still decisions to be made every hour of every day. The ability to keep moving when everything was falling apart was the specific quality that had made him extraordinary, and it served him again in 1812 and 1813 and into the spring of 1814. And then it stopped being enough. He abdicated in April 1814 and went to Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany that the Allies assigned him as a kind of miniature kingdom. He ruled it with the same energy he had applied to France, reorganizing the administration, improving the roads, reviewing the small army that had been assigned to him. He read voraciously. He planned. He watched the newspapers for news of France. And then, in February 1815, he got on a ship and sailed back to France with 1,100 soldiers and the conviction that his enemies had made a mistake. He was right. The French army, which had been required to serve under the returned Bourbon King Louis XVIII, came over to Napoleon almost entirely without a fight. Unit after unit declared for the emperor. The king fled. Napoleon entered Paris on March the 20th, 100 days before Waterloo, to crowds that were not exactly the same as the crowds at his coronation but were large and real and cheering. He knew, even then, that the odds were against him. The great powers of Europe, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, had immediately declared him an outlaw and mobilized their armies. He had perhaps 3 months before they were ready to move. He needed to win quickly and decisively, and then negotiate from a position of strength. He did not need much. He needed one decisive victory. He almost got it. At Waterloo, on June the 18th, 1815, the battle went against him in the late afternoon when the Prussian army arrived on his flank, earlier than expected, in greater numbers than expected, and Wellington's British line held when it should, by every calculation, have broken. Napoleon threw the Imperial Guard forward in the final assault, the unit that had never been broken, that had won a dozen impossible actions, and the Guard was stopped, and began to retreat, and the retreat became a rout, and by nightfall the French army was dissolving in the darkness of the Belgian countryside. Napoleon left the field on horseback, surrounded by a small escort, and rode through the night. He reached Paris days later and attempted to rally support for one more campaign. The politicians had had enough. He abdicated for the second time on June the 22nd and surrendered to the British warship Bellerophon on July the 15th. He expected to be exiled to England, or perhaps America. He wrote a letter to the Prince Regent comparing himself to Themistocles, the Athenian general who had taken refuge with his former enemies. The Prince Regent did not respond. He was sent to St. Helena. On St. Helena, in his lamplit study, Napoleon puts down the page he has been reading and closes his eyes. The island is very quiet now. The wind has dropped for once, and in the silence you can hear the distant sound of the waves at the base of the cliffs, a soft and regular sound, the breathing of the ocean. He listens to it with his eyes closed. He is very tired. The pain has been worse today. The doctor came and went and left him something to drink that helps a little, and he has taken it, and now the pain is slightly distant, muffled, present but not overwhelming. He thinks of Josephine. They had been divorced for 5 years when she died, in 1814, just before his first abdication. She died while he was still emperor, which was both the last thing and not the last thing. He had divorced her because she had given him no children and the empire needed an heir. It was a political decision made with his eyes open, and he made it, and it was the right decision politically, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. Josephine had understood him in a way that Marie-Louise, his second wife, did not and perhaps could not. She had known him before he was emperor, when he was a thin young general from Corsica who wrote her letters of embarrassing intensity and who was by turns calculating and reckless, brilliant and insecure, entirely sure of himself and entirely uncertain. She had seen him whole, in other words, and had loved him anyway, or at least had accepted him, which was perhaps more durable. He does not think of Marie-Louise much. She has remarried already, to the Austrian general who was assigned to supervise her after Napoleon's first exile. She has kept their son from him, or allowed him to be kept. He does not blame her entirely. She was 23 when he was sent away. She had her own life to live. But Josephine he thinks of. Let the room on St. Helena settle into quietness around you. The lamp burning low. The papers on the table. The distant sound of the waves. The man with his eyes closed, thinking of a woman who has been dead for 7 years. You are drifting. The night is deep and warm and still. There is nothing left to do but let yourself go. On St. Helena, Napoleon had a servant who sometimes read to him in the evenings, novels, mostly, and poetry, and occasionally history. He was particular about history. He had opinions about how historical events should be interpreted, and he could not always keep those opinions from interrupting the reading with extended commentary. His servants learned to read slowly and to pause frequently, anticipating the interruptions. He had Plutarch read to him sometimes. The lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, the same text he had read as a boy in Corsica, the book that had shaped his earliest understanding of greatness and what it required. He had read about Caesar, and Alexander, and Pompey, and Scipio, and all the other men whose names were bywords for achievement and power and eventual downfall. He had read about them as a boy and thought, I could do what they did. I could do better. He had done better, by certain measures. He had governed more people, won more battles, held power for longer. He had survived enemies and disasters that would have destroyed most men. He had done it all while building something real, the code, the institutions, the infrastructure, rather than simply fighting and conquering and moving on. And he had lost it all. More completely than most of them had lost it. Caesar had died at the height of his power, assassinated before his decline could begin. Alexander had died at 32, before the empire had a chance to fall apart under his own rule. Napoleon had lost everything slowly, over years, had been given back 100 days and then lost it again more finally, and then sent to an island from which there was nowhere to escape and given nothing to do but wait. This was the part Plutarch had not quite prepared him for. The waiting. The nothing. He picks up the page again and tries to read, but the words blur slightly and he sets it down. The lamp is burning low. He should probably sleep. He knows he probably won't. He thinks, I was right about most things. He thinks, I was wrong about Russia. He thinks, I should have stopped after Tilsit. He thinks, if I had stopped after Tilsit, I would have died bored within 5 years. He thinks, Josephine. Let the lamplit room settle around you. The wind moving outside. The papers on the table. The man who had once moved armies across a continent, sitting still in the small hours of the night on a remote island, thinking about a woman who has been dead for 7 years. You are almost asleep. Let the image fade. Let the island fade. Let the sound of the Atlantic grow very soft and then stop entirely as the sleep comes up to meet you, warm and deep and absolute. There is nothing left but rest. There is a letter that Napoleon wrote on St. Helena that was never sent, or rather, it was sent but never acknowledged, which amounted to the same thing. It was addressed to the Emperor Alexander of Russia, the same Tsar Alexander who had been his ally, then his enemy, then the man whose armies had occupied Paris. Napoleon wrote to him asking for permission to go to America. Not as a public figure, not as a political presence, just as a private man who wished to live out his remaining years somewhere that was not a small island in the middle of the South Atlantic. He proposed to live quietly. He proposed to renounce all political activity. He proposed simply to be allowed to exist somewhere with more room than St. Helena offered, somewhere with a climate that did not grind steadily at his health. The letter was sent through diplomatic channels. The answer, if there was an answer, did not reach Napoleon. Perhaps Alexander never received it. Perhaps he received it and did not respond. Perhaps the response was lost. The British, who controlled all communications to and from the island, may have intercepted it. We do not know. What we know is that Napoleon stayed on St. Helena, and that the request, one of the few genuinely modest things Napoleon ever asked for, was not granted, and that he died there, in the wind and the damp, far from everywhere he had ever loved. On the night table beside his bed, in the last weeks, there were two things he kept close: a miniature portrait of his son, painted when the boy was perhaps 4 years old, and a lock of Josephine's hair that he had carried since their divorce. These two things. Everything else, the empire, the battles, the code, the maps, the speeches, the 20 years of making history, all of that was somewhere else. In the last nights, it was just the portrait and the lock of hair. It was just the people he had loved and lost. Let the room grow very quiet around you now. Let the lamp go out. Let the wind drop. Let the ocean grow still. The night is very deep and you are very nearly there, at the bottom of sleep, where it is warm and dark and nothing is required of you, and you are safe and still, and the long night holds you, and there is nothing left but rest. The soldiers who had followed Napoleon through the worst of his campaigns, the crossing of the Beresina in 1812, when the Russian winter had reduced 600,000 men to a column of stumbling ghosts, these men had a name for him that they used when officers were not nearby, a name that was not his title and not his rank but something that belonged only to them and to him, the name of a relationship that had no formal designation. They called him the Little Corporal, Le Petit Caporal, a name that came from the very early days of his career when he had been a young artillery officer and had fought alongside his men in a way that was not expected of officers of his class and background. The name stuck because it captured something true, that whatever else he was, whatever titles he accumulated and whatever empire he built, there was always underneath it the young man who had come from nowhere and made himself through his own effort and his own will, the self-made man, the corporal who had become emperor and who had never entirely stopped being a corporal. On St. Helena, when they came to him, the small court of loyal followers who had chosen exile, they sometimes called him sire, the formal address for an emperor, and sometimes they called him El Empereur, and in the private moments, in the evenings when the formality dropped a little and the company was only his closest companions, they called him simply General. General. Not Emperor. Not Sire. General. He had been many things in his life, but he had been General first, and General was the thing that had made him what he was, and General was the name he answered to with something most like peace. The wind is moving outside the windows of Longwood House. The lamp is burning low. The papers on the table are still. The man who was once general, then emperor, then prisoner, then general again for 100 days, then prisoner again, he is asleep at last, in the deep hours of the night, and the wind goes on, and the ocean goes on, and the stars turn overhead, and you are asleep too, deeply and completely, and there is nothing left anywhere but rest. Let yourself go. You are safe and still and the night holds you gently. There is nothing left to do but sleep. Let the world grow very quiet around you. Let your breathing settle into its slow, natural rhythm. Let your thoughts move apart from each other like clouds in a clearing sky until there is only open space and stillness and the soft sound of this voice. Tonight we are going to China. We are going to the city of Beijing, to a place that has stood at the center of Chinese civilization for 5 centuries. We are going to the Forbidden City. It is February of 1912. Winter in Beijing is harsh, a dry, bone-cutting cold that comes down from the Mongolian steppe to the north, carrying fine yellow dust from the Gobi Desert that coats everything and seeps through every crack in every door and window. At night the temperature drops well below freezing, and the breath of the palace guard standing at their posts rises in pale plumes in the lamplight, and the golden roofs of the Forbidden City are rimmed with frost. The Forbidden City is immense. It covers 180 acres in the heart of Beijing, surrounded by walls 35 feet high and a moat 60 feet wide. It contains 980 buildings. Since 1420, when the Yongle Emperor moved the capital to Beijing and constructed this palace complex, it has been the home and the seat of power of the Son of Heaven, the Emperor of China. 24 emperors have lived and died within these walls. The 24th emperor is a boy of 6 years old. His name, in the world outside the palace, is Joro Puyi. Inside the palace, he is known simply as the emperor, or by his reign title, Shentong. He became emperor at the age of 2 years and 10 months, when his great-uncle the Guangxu emperor died suddenly, and the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had dominated Chinese politics for decades, made a final decision before her own death the following day. She chose this toddler, this great-nephew of the dead emperor, as the next son of heaven. She chose him, the whispers said, partly because he was so young. A child emperor meant years of regency, years of power for whoever held the strings behind the throne. It was a calculation, and like so many of Cixi's calculations, it was ultimately undone by forces she had underestimated. Breathe slowly. Let the image of the Forbidden City settle in your mind, the immense courtyards, the golden roofs, the red walls, the frost. Outside the walls of the Forbidden City, China is in revolution. It began in October 1911, in the city of Wuhan, where an accidental explosion in a revolutionary storehouse led to a mutiny among the local garrison troops, which spread with astonishing speed across the country. Province after province declared independence from the Qing dynasty. Cities that had been loyal for generations fell in days. The Qing court in Beijing, isolated within its walls, was watching the empire dissolve around it with an air of unreality, as if the reports coming in from the provinces were happening in some other country, in some other story. The Empress Dowager Longyu, the widow of the Guangxu emperor, now serving as regent for the child emperor, understood what was happening, even if she could not stop it. She was 50 years old, a woman of intelligence and limited power, doing her best to navigate a crisis that had been building for decades. The Qing dynasty had been weakening since the Opium War of 1839, when British gunboats had forced open Chinese ports and made clear that the technological gap between China and the industrialized West was enormous and growing. In the 70 years since, China had been humiliated repeatedly by Britain, by France, by Japan, by the Eight-Nation Alliance that had occupied Beijing itself during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. The Qing court had tried to modernize. It had sent students abroad, reformed the examination system, built railways, established a new army trained on Western models. But the reforms came too late and moved too slowly, and the men who had studied abroad came home with ideas about constitutions and republics that sat uneasily with the reality of a dynasty that had ruled by divine mandate for 270 years. Now, in February 1912, the dynasty's last hours have arrived. Let your body grow heavy with rest. Let the cold Beijing night settle around you like a blanket. In the inner court of the Forbidden City, in the private chambers that no outsider ever entered, the 6-year-old emperor is being prepared for bed by his nurses and attendants. Puyi, in the memoirs he would write much later, recalled his childhood in the Forbidden City as a strange and lonely dream. He was surrounded by hundreds of eunuchs and servants whose only purpose was to attend to his needs, and yet he was profoundly alone in any meaningful sense. No one spoke to him as a child, they addressed him as they addressed the Son of Heaven, with elaborate ceremony and ritual deference. When he walked through the palace courtyards, the servants prostrated themselves without being asked, their foreheads touching the cold stone. When he spoke, his words were received as imperial pronouncements, not as the observations of a 6-year-old boy. He played in the gardens of the Forbidden City alone, or with his younger brother Puyi, who was brought to visit occasionally. He caught crickets in the long grass and kept them in small lacquer boxes. He rode a bicycle through the vast courtyards when he was old enough, the absurdity of a boy on a bicycle in the world's most formal palace apparently troubling no one. He understood, in the vague way of a young child, that he was important, that the world arranged itself around him in a particular way. He did not understand what that meant, or what it might cost him. Tonight, in his chambers, the boy is unaware of what is being decided in the rooms nearby. In the Hall of Mental Cultivation, which served as the administrative heart of the inner court, the Empress Dowager Longyu has been in conference with Yuan Shikai, the general who commands what remains of the imperial army. Yuan Shikai is a complicated man, a pragmatist, an opportunist, a man who has spent his career navigating the impossible currents of late Qing politics and who has emerged, in this final crisis, as the most powerful individual in China. He controls the military. Without his support, the Qing court has no force to put down the revolution. And Yuan Shikai has told the Empress Dowager, in terms that are perfectly polite and utterly unambiguous, that he cannot put down the revolution. That the dynasty must abdicate. Breathe. Let the quiet of the winter night hold you. The negotiations over the terms of abdication have been going on for weeks. The revolutionary government in Nanjing, led by Sun Yat-sen, has been reasonably generous. They understand that a clean transfer of power is better than a prolonged civil war, and they want the world to see that the Chinese Republic begins in dignity rather than chaos. The terms they have offered include, the emperor will retain his imperial title for life. He will continue to live in the Forbidden City, attended by his full household. He will receive an annual stipend from the new republic. He will be treated with all the ceremonial respect due to a foreign sovereign. In exchange, he will give up the thing that matters most, the mandate of heaven. The right to rule. The 2,000-year-old idea that the Chinese emperor was the son of the divine principle that ordered the universe, that his authority was cosmic and not merely political, that to resist the emperor was to resist the structure of reality itself. The Empress Dowager has spent weeks trying to find an alternative. She has sent messages to foreign embassies, hoping for intervention. She has consulted with the princes of the imperial clan. She has prayed in the temple in the Forbidden City where the imperial family had prayed for 500 years. There is no alternative. On the evening of February the 11th, she calls the senior members of the imperial household and the senior officials of the court into the hall of mental cultivation, and she reads to them the Edict of Abdication. The edict was written by Zhong Jian, one of the most respected officials in the empire, a man of impeccable Confucian credentials. He had drafted the document with great care, choosing language that acknowledged the reality of what was happening while preserving as much dignity as possible. The edict does not say that the dynasty has been overthrown. It says that the emperor, perceiving the will of heaven and the wishes of the people, has decided to relinquish the throne to allow the establishment of a republic. It frames the abdication as a choice, an act of benevolence, rather than a defeat. Let yourself rest deeper into stillness now. The night is very quiet and very cold outside the walls of the Forbidden City, and inside, in the lamplit hall, the Empress Dowager's voice reads the words that end 2,000 years of imperial China. In his chambers, the 6-year-old emperor is asleep. He does not know what is happening. No one has explained it to him in terms he could understand, because no one knows how to explain to a 6-year-old child that the universe he was born into, in which he was the center, the son of heaven, the organizing principle around which all else revolved, no longer exists. That it will cease to exist at noon tomorrow, when the edict takes effect. Puyi will learn later, much later, from books and from the memories of the adults around him. He will write, in his memoirs, that he was playing in the garden when someone told him he was no longer emperor, that he received this information and then went back to playing, because at 6 years old, the distinction between being an emperor and not being one was not yet clear to him. The eunuchs and servants in the palace are less composed. For the eunuchs especially, the abdication is a catastrophe. The eunuch system, men castrated in childhood and sold or given to the imperial household, had existed in China for centuries, and the eunuchs of the Forbidden City had built their entire existence around their position inside those walls. They had no family homes to return to in most cases, no skills marketable outside a palace, no identity outside their roles. The older ones wept openly in the corridors that night. The younger ones moved through the palace with the stunned, mechanical quality of people who have not yet processed what they have been told. Outside the walls, Beijing is quiet. It is late at night, and the cold has kept people indoors, and the news has not yet fully spread. Tomorrow the newspapers will carry the text of the edict. Tomorrow the city will understand. Tomorrow the Republic of China will begin. But tonight there is only the Forbidden City, its golden roof silvered with frost, its 980 buildings lit by lanterns and oil lamps, its thousands of inhabitants navigating the last night of an order that has lasted, in one form or another, for 2,000 years. Breathe slowly. Let the image of the Forbidden City at night rest behind your eyes, the vast courtyards, the red walls, the frost on the golden roofs, the lanterns. The imperial seals, the jade seals that had been used to authenticate imperial documents for centuries, that bore the characters for the mandate of heaven, that were the physical embodiment of imperial authority, were brought out that night for the last time. The Empress Dowager affixed them to the abdication edict. It took a long time. There were many seals, each one requiring a specific procedure, a specific posture, a specific set of words spoken beforehand. The officials responsible for the seals performed each step with the same meticulous care they had always performed it, because this was what they knew how to do, and because doing it carefully was the only thing left to give to the dynasty that had defined their lives. When it was done, the edict was folded and placed in its case, and the case was sealed, and the seal holders were returned to their cabinets, and the officials bowed and withdrew, and the Empress Dowager was alone in the hall with a single attendant and the lamp and the cold. She sat for a moment without speaking. Then she rose and walked back through the corridor to her chambers, and the attendant followed with the lamp, and the hall fell dark. You are almost asleep now. Let the Forbidden City fade, the courtyards, the walls, the frost, the silence. Puyi would live in the Forbidden City for another 12 years, a diminishing figure in an increasingly irrelevant ceremony. In 1924, a warlord would expel him from the palace entirely. He would spend the following decades in adventures that included being briefly restored as emperor under Japanese sponsorship in Manchuria, capture by the Soviets at the end of World War II, and imprisonment by the Communist government of China. Finally, he was released, as an ordinary citizen, the last emperor working as a gardener in the Beijing Botanical Garden. He died in 1967, at the age of 61, during the Cultural Revolution. He was buried, eventually, in a commercial cemetery outside Beijing, among ordinary people. His story is one of the strangest in history, a man born at the absolute center of power, surrounded by ceremony and the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of imperial tradition, who spent most of his life being stripped, layer by layer, of everything that surrounding had implied. Who ended as a gardener. Whether the gardener was happier than the emperor, his memoirs suggest that he was. That ordinary life, with its ordinary pleasures and ordinary sorrows, was something he came to value precisely because it had been denied to him so completely at the beginning. Lie still now. The night is very deep and very quiet around you. You are safe and warm, and the long story is done. Somewhere very far away, in the heart of Beijing, the Forbidden City is still standing. The golden roofs still catch the morning sun. The great red walls still stand. Tourists come every day and walk through the courtyards where emperors walked, and stand in the Hall of Supreme Harmony and try to imagine what it felt like to stand there and be called the Son of Heaven. But the boy who slept through the last night of that world, who caught crickets in the long grass and rode his bicycle through the vast courtyards and became, in the end, a gardener, he is gone, and the dynasty is gone, and the 2,000 years are done. And you are drifting now, very gently and completely, into sleep. The night holds you. The darkness is warm. There is nothing left but rest. There was a moment, sometime in the middle of his reign, if reign is the right word for the condition of a child who had been placed on a throne by adults and managed by adults and would be removed by adults and who had essentially no agency in any part of the enterprise. There was a moment when Puyi first understood, in a way that penetrated deeper than the mere intellectual knowledge he had always had, that the world inside the Forbidden City and the world outside it were not the same world. He was perhaps 10 years old. A eunuch had been teaching him, as eunuchs often did, about the proper form of address for various categories of official, and Puyi had asked a question about something outside the palace walls, about how a particular kind of person conducted themselves when they weren't in the palace, when they were just living their ordinary life in the city. The eunuch had answered, and Puyi had realized, listening to the answer, that the eunuch had no idea, The eunuch had been in the palace since childhood. He had never lived an ordinary life in the city. He knew the world inside the forbidden city with the thoroughness of a man who had spent decades learning every nuance of its intricate social hierarchy. The world outside was to him a rumor, a place that other people lived, a concept rather than a reality. And looking at the eunuch, Puyi had understood that this was also true of himself. He was the Emperor of China. He had been informed of this fact his entire life. He had been dressed in yellow, which was the imperial color, which no one else was permitted to wear. He had been carried in his palanquin through the palace courtyards rather than permitted to walk. He had been addressed with ritual words that had been composed centuries ago to elevate the emperor above the common human condition. He had been treated, from the first moment of his life, as something that was not quite the same species as everyone else. And he had never, not once, left the forbidden city. He had never walked on a public street, bought anything in a market, heard ordinary people talking to each other in the ordinary way. He had never experienced cold or hunger or inconvenience of any kind. He had never been in a room where someone did not immediately arrange themselves around him and attend to his needs. He was the Son of Heaven, and he was completely dependent on the people around him, and he was 10 years old, and he had never really seen the world that he was supposed to rule. Let this settle in your mind for a moment. The vast palace. The child emperor. The world outside the walls. Breathe slowly. You are very comfortable. The night holds you gently. After the abdication, Puyi continued to live in the inner court of the forbidden city, as the terms of the agreement specified. The outer buildings, the great ceremonial halls, the wide official courtyards, became a public museum, which opened to visitors in 1914. Puyi could sometimes hear the voices of the tourists in the distance, an unfamiliar sound in a place that had always been silent except for the voices of those who belonged there. He continued to be addressed as emperor. He continued to hold court, in a diminished and increasingly meaningless way. He continued to be attended by his eunuchs and servants. His tutors continued his education, languages, history, mathematics. He developed a particular aptitude for English, and in 1919 he hired an English tutor named Reginald Johnston, who was one of the first people to treat Puyi as something like a normal person and to speak to him with something like directness. Johnston found a young man of considerable intelligence who had been almost entirely infantilized by his upbringing. Puyi was 16 when Johnston arrived, and he could not tie his own shoes. He had never made a decision that affected anyone but himself in any practical way. He had been so comprehensively attended to, so completely insulated from the ordinary tasks of self-management, that he had none of the basic competencies that children in the world outside the palace developed automatically simply by living their lives. Johnston worked to remedy this, with some success. He taught Puyi to ride a bicycle, which became one of Puyi's great pleasures, the freedom of movement, the relative autonomy, the sensation of choosing your own direction. He encouraged Puyi to read widely, to ask questions about the world outside, to think about his own situation with some critical distance. He also, inadvertently, increased Puyi's acute sense of the unreality of his existence. In 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiong surrounded the Forbidden City with his troops and gave Puyi 24 hours to leave. The terms of the 1912 agreement were abrogated. The stipend was ended. The title of emperor, inside China, was revoked. Puyi packed his belongings, the belongings of a man who had never needed to pack before, who had always had servants to pack for him, who had never needed to decide which of his possessions mattered most, and left the Forbidden City for the first time in his life. He was 18 years old. He stepped through the gate of the palace where he had been born and where he had lived his entire life, and he walked out into the streets of Beijing, and the city was just a city. People were walking past without prostrating themselves. Horses and carts moved through the streets without clearing a path for him. The wind was cold and there was dust in it. Nobody looked at him twice. He stood in the street and tried to understand where he was, which was somewhere he had never been before, which was simply outside. Let the image of that moment rest in your mind. The young man standing in the street. The palace gates closing behind him. The ordinary city going about its ordinary business. The Son of Heaven, who was no longer the Son of Heaven, standing in the dust with his bags. Breathe. You are safe and still, and the night is deep around you. The years that followed were complicated and often painful. Puyi spent time in Tianjin under Japanese protection, then was convinced, or coerced, it is genuinely unclear how much choice he had, to become the Emperor of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state established in northeast China in 1932. He served as Emperor of Manchukuo for 13 years, with decreasing actual power and increasing understanding of what he had been made into. The Japanese controlled the government. The Japanese controlled the military. The Japanese controlled his schedule, his correspondence, his access to information. He was, again, a man on a throne who could not leave. When the Soviet army invaded Manchukuo in August 1945, in the last days of the Pacific War, Puyi was attempting to flee to Japan. He was captured at an airport, put on a Soviet plane, and taken to Siberia, where he spent 5 years in a Soviet detention facility. The Soviets, to his surprise, treated him reasonably well. He had expected execution, or at minimum harsh captivity. Instead, he was housed adequately, fed adequately, required to work in the gardens and fields of the facility along with other prisoners, and left largely alone. He had time to read. He had time to think. He had, for the first time in his life, something approaching privacy. He thought a great deal about who he was and how he had gotten to this particular point, a former emperor of China, sitting in Siberia, pulling weeds in a garden. He thought about the choices he had made and the choices that had been made for him, and he tried to understand where the boundary was between the two, and he found the boundary harder to locate than he had expected. He was transferred to Chinese custody in 1950 and spent 9 years in a prison in Fushan, in northeast China, undergoing what the communist government called re-education. The process was long and systematic and involved extensive self-criticism sessions in which prisoners were expected to articulate and repudiate the errors of their previous lives. Puyi, who had a great deal to repudiate, participated in these sessions with an earnestness that his guards and fellow prisoners found either genuine or very well performed. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps by the end, the performance had become real. He was released in 1959 and lived as an ordinary citizen in Beijing for the remaining 8 years of his life. He worked for a time as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden. He remarried a nurse named Li Shuxian, the 5th of his official wives, and by his own account the first who was chosen with anything like his genuine consent. He wrote his memoirs, which were published in 1964 under the title From Emperor to Citizen, and which tell the story of his life with a frankness that is sometimes startling and a self-awareness that was clearly hard-won over a lifetime of not having it. He died in October 1967, at the age of 61, of kidney cancer, during the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, which was then at its most extreme, had been destroying the remnants of the old China, smashing temples, burning books, persecuting intellectuals and anyone associated with the old regime. Puyi's death was noted briefly in the newspapers and then mostly ignored. There were larger things happening. He was buried in a commercial cemetery outside Beijing. Years later, his remains were moved to a cemetery near the Western Qing tombs, where several Qing emperors are interred, which was perhaps a small posthumous concession to what he had been. The last emperor rests near the tombs of the dynasty he ended. Let the Forbidden City rest in your mind for a final moment, the golden roofs, the red walls, the vast empty courtyards where a boy once caught crickets and rode his bicycle through the silence. The place still stands. The tourists still come. The history is still there, preserved in stone and tile and wood, speaking to anyone who cares to listen. You are drifting now into the deep water of sleep, quietly and completely. The night holds you warmly. The darkness is gentle. The long story of the last emperor is told, and you are safe, and still, and there is nothing left but rest. In the years after his release from prison, Puyi walked the streets of Beijing as an ordinary man, and what struck him most, he wrote later, was how ordinary it felt. Not how strange, not how overwhelming, how ordinary. He had expected to feel alien in this world outside the palace walls, the world he had spent his entire childhood so carefully insulated from. He had expected to feel like a man arriving in a foreign country where the customs were unfamiliar and the language was different and the rules of conduct were unknown to him. Instead, he walked through Beijing and felt something that he had never felt inside the Forbidden City, which was unremarkable. He was no one. He could buy vegetables in a market without ceremony. He could take the bus. He could sit in a park. He could watch people going about their lives without anyone bowing or prostrating or arranging themselves in reference to him. Nobody cared who he was. It was, he wrote, the first real freedom he had ever experienced. This is not quite what you would expect someone to say, if you thought about it only abstractly. He had been Emperor of China. He had had absolute power, or the performance of it. He had been the Son of Heaven. And now he was nobody, and it felt like freedom. But if you think about it from inside his actual experience, from inside the Forbidden City, the ceremony, the elaborate unreality of a child raised to be a symbol rather than a person, it makes sense. The palace was not a place of freedom. It was a very elaborate, very beautiful prison. The ceremonies were not celebrations. They were the walls of the cell. On the outside, he could choose what he ate for breakfast. He could decide to go for a walk without informing anyone, without the walk becoming a procession, without servants running ahead to clear the path. He could be tired without it being recorded in the court documents. He could be happy without it being interpreted as an imperial pronouncement. He could just be a person. He and Li Shuxian, his last wife, lived quietly in Beijing in the years after his release. They went to the movies. They visited friends. He tended his garden with the same careful attention he had once given to the ceremonial aspects of his imperial role, but now the work was his own and the outcome was his own and nobody was watching to make sure he did it correctly. He told an interview once that he was happier than he had ever been. The interview, understandably, found this hard to believe, and said so. Puyi thought about it for a moment and said, "When I was emperor, I could not do anything for myself. Now I can do everything for myself." Which life would you rather have? The Forbidden City is still there. The tourists come every day and walk through the courtyards and stand in the great halls and take photographs of the thrones where 24 emperors once sat. The red walls still stand. The golden roofs still catch the afternoon light. 2 million people visit every year. None of them are the Son of Heaven. Breathe slowly. Let the image of the Forbidden City rest behind your eyes one last time, the vast courtyards, the frost on the golden tiles in winter, the lanterns lit at night, the silence that falls when the tourists go home and the gates close and the old palace is alone with its history. You are very deeply asleep now, or very nearly. The night is warm and still and complete around you. The long stories of the men who were kings are told, and they are resting, all of them, in their various places of rest. And you are resting too, in the warmth and the dark, and there is nothing left to do and nowhere left to go and the night is long and you are safe and the sleep is coming now, deep and final, like a slow-worn tide. Let it take you. You are already there. The garden at the Beijing Botanical Garden where Puyi worked in the last years of his life was full of peonies. This is a detail that appears in several accounts of his life as an ordinary citizen, mentioned almost as a curiosity, the last emperor of China, tending peonies. But if you know anything about the peony's place in Chinese culture, it is not a curiosity at all. The peony is the flower of prosperity and high honor, associated for centuries with the imperial family, featured in the silk embroidery of imperial robes, cultivated in the gardens of the Forbidden City for the pleasure of the emperor. There is something either deeply ironic or deeply appropriate about Puyi spending his last years tending this particular flower. Perhaps both. Puyi himself, asked about it once, apparently gave a practical answer. the peonies needed careful attention to bloom properly, and he liked careful work. He had always liked careful work, he said. He had just not always had access to it. On the days when the peonies bloomed, in late spring, great heavy flowers of red and pink and white, nodding on their stems in the morning light, Puyi would stop and look at them for a while before going back to his other tasks. He did not write about what he thought when he looked at them. He did not explain whether he was thinking about the Forbidden City or simply seeing the flowers as flowers. Perhaps by then the flowers were just flowers. Perhaps by then he had lived enough ordinary days that the extraordinary thing he had been was just a memory, belonging to someone else's life rather than his own. Lie still now. The night is very deep and very warm around you. You are completely at rest. The long stories of the men who were kings are done. Alexander in his Babylon, Caesar in his Rome, Napoleon on his island, and Puyi in his garden, all of them gone, all of them resting in the long silence of history. And you are resting too, in the warmth and the dark, breathing slowly, drifting down into sleep that is deep and complete and dreamless. The night holds you. You are safe. There is nothing left to do and nowhere left to go. The darkness is warm and the silence is complete and you are already there. There is a photograph, taken sometime in the early 1960s, that shows Puyi standing in a street in Beijing, wearing ordinary clothes, holding a bag of groceries. He is looking at the camera with an expression that is difficult to interpret, not quite smiling, not quite not smiling, the expression of a man who is comfortable enough in the moment but aware of its strangeness, the strangeness of being photographed in a street holding groceries when the person taking the photograph knows who he is. He looks like a person. Not a symbol, not an emperor, not a prisoner, not a curiosity, just a person on a street, with a bag of groceries, on an ordinary day in an ordinary city. This is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to have arrived at, given where he started. A man who was raised in the Forbidden City, who was carried rather than permitted to walk, who was addressed with words composed centuries ago to elevate him above the common human condition, this man is standing in a street with a bag of groceries, and he looks, in the photograph, at peace with it. The groceries in the bag, whatever they were, vegetables from the market, probably, or perhaps some fruit in season, these things that he had chosen himself, that he had paid for himself from the wages of his own work, that were going home to be cooked in a kitchen where he was no one special, just another Beijing resident coming home in the afternoon. These ordinary things were the measure of how far he had traveled, not from power to powerlessness, but from unreality to reality. From being a symbol to being a person. From the Forbidden City to a street in Beijing with a bag of groceries. Let the image rest in you now, quietly and without judgment. The ordinary street. The ordinary groceries. The man who was once the son of heaven, standing in the afternoon light, looking at a camera, almost smiling. You are breathing very slowly. You are completely at rest. The night has grown to its fullest depth around you, and you are in the warm center of it, and the sleep is complete, and the stories are done, and there is nothing left anywhere in the world but the soft sound of your own breathing, and the dark, and the rest. Let yourself go. You are already there. The night holds you. Sleep. And you are drifting now, very gently and completely, into sleep. The night holds you. The darkness is warm. There is nothing left but rest.